The Real News. I'm Aaron Maté. We're continuing with Norman Finkelstein, author of many books, including his latest, Gaza, An Inquest into Its Martyrdom. And we're talking about the Great March of Return in Gaza. All right, Norman, so you were talking before the break a little about how the New York Times has been covering the Great March of Return. And I want to stay on that theme and talk about some of the talking points that Israel has put forward in trying to justify its firing on Gaza protesters, which is that these protesters pose a threat to Israeli citizens in trying to cross over from Gaza, and also that this march is the work of Hamas. So Hamas is behind the march. Some of the protesters who have been killed are members of of Hamas's armed wing, which proves that this is really just an entire plot by Hamas. So can you address that?
Well, first of all, in most of the human rights and media, well, let's start with the human rights. In most of the human rights accounts of what's going on in Gaza, they refer to Israel's use of disproportionate force and indiscriminate force. And then the question arises, if they're accusing Israel of disproportionate force and indiscriminate force, are you implying that Israel has the right to use proportionate force and discriminate force? The law, I think, is pretty clear in that question. Israel doesn't have the right to use any force. Now, that may sound over the top, but what is the law? Gaza is under occupation. Gaza is struggling for self-determination, the right to self-determination and statehood. That's been the preeminent demand of the Palestinian national movement, and that demand has been ratified by the United Nations and other responsible political institutions and agencies. So, what is the law? The law is, under international law, a movement struggling for self-determination or struggling to free itself of alien occupation is not prohibited from using armed force to achieve its objective. That's to say, the Palestinians have the right, under international law, to use armed force in order to end an alien occupation and to achieve self-determination. The law is unequivocal. There is no dispute whatsoever among specialists in the field that an occupying power or a power denying the right to self-determination of a people does not have the right to use any force. Israel has no right to use any force. They don't have the right to use proportionate force. They don't have the right to use discriminate force. They have no right to use any force. And so, in my opinion, the human rights organizations have been very misleading in condemning Israel for using quote-unquote disproportionate and indiscriminate force. In addition, those determinations, disproportionate, indiscriminate, they're wholly irrelevant to the situation in Gaza. Israel is not using disproportionate force. It is not using indiscriminate force. Israel is using very discriminate force. It's targeting civilians. It's targeting unarmed civilians. That's not indiscriminate or disproportionate force. Those are crimes against humanity. You're targeting a non-violent civilian population. The second part is Israel defending a border? Is that what's happening? Israel claims it has the right to defend its border. Well, is that a border as if between two sovereign states? Is that a border? Let's see what fairly uncontroversial people have to say. The distinguished sociologist from Hebrew University, Baruch Kimmerling, in 2003, that's before Israel imposed the brutal blockade of Gaza. The blockade began in 2006. Already back in 2003, Baruch Kimmerling described Gaza as the largest concentration camp ever to exist. The largest concentration camp ever to exist. Haaretz newspaper, Israel's most respected, not widely read, but most respected newspaper, it described Gaza as a ghetto. David Cameron, the former British conservative prime minister, Cameron called it an open-air prison. That's not a border. That's a concentration camp fence. That's a ghetto fence. That's a prison gate. That's the fact. People don't want to hear it. That's the fact. They're not trying to penetrate a border. They're trying to break free from a concentration camp. They're trying to break free from a ghetto. They're trying to break out of a prison that's poisoning 1 million children. And then you have to ask yourself the question, let's leave aside the legalities, the law, as I recited it. Let's leave aside the technicalities, whether it's disproportionate force, proportionate force, indiscriminate force, discriminate force, or is it the targeting of civilians? Let's leave all of that aside. And let's ask a simple question. Does Israel have the right to poison 1 million children? If it doesn't have that right, it has no right to use any force. Case closed, full stop.
And it only has obligations to stop poisoning children and stop the occupation.
Yeah, it has one right. It has the right to pack up and leave.
Right. So I want to ask you about the global response, both by governments of the world, but also from citizens, from people even who are sympathetic to the Palestinian cause. I can say that here in New York, where we are, we haven't seen a lot of demonstrations yet in support of Gaza. And I'm wondering if you could comment on that, your sense of how the world is responding to week after week Gazans marching out, protesting and being shot dead.
Well, first of all, we have to have a kind of framework for understanding the situation. Nonviolent resistance can't work without public support. I don't think many people understand Gandhi's doctrine of nonviolence. Gandhi felt, in Gandhi's opinion, politics was not about trying to change public opinion. It was trying to get people to act on what they already know is wrong. And Gandhi was of the view, it's a kind of, I guess it's a pessimistic view of human nature. He said the only thing that gets people to act is when they see people suffering, in particular getting killed, using legitimate methods that the public considers legitimate, in order to achieve a legitimate end. And so you go on a fast which the public sees as legitimate, and you set a goal which the public sees as legitimate. So your methods have to be seen as legitimate, and your goal has to be seen as legitimate. And then hopefully, Gandhi says, if you suffer enough, then the public will move from a passive agreement to active engagement. So, concretely, what does that mean? Sounds very theoretical. So let's see it concretely. Probably the most brilliant application of Gandhi's tactics was not in India. It was actually in the American South. So the American South, they engaged in nonviolent resistance.
During the 60s.
During the Civil Rights Movement, during the Civil Rights Movement. And they set themselves goals, objectives, which the public has to see as unimpeachable. So, for example, the right to vote, well, that's the 15th Amendment to the Constitution. End of segregation, well, that's Brown versus Board of Education, the Supreme Court decision. So they're setting goals which can't be disputed by the public, and they're using tactics which the public can't find impeachable. That's how it works. But then the people in the South came up against the problem. Namely, the South was unmovable. They were dug in very deep. And
they couldn't melt their hearts.
You couldn't melt their hearts.
Yeah.
There was no way. And they recognized the people in the South. They said, eventually we're going to be ground under unless we can arouse the conscience of the North and the federal government and get them to impose their will on the South.
I see where you're going here. So here today, the North is the rest of the world.
That's correct.
Yeah. Because you're not going to melt the hearts of Israelis.
Right, you're wasting your time.
So far to the right.
It's pointless.
Yeah.
The Israelis are dug in like the American South.
Just to illustrate.
If you just look at the statistics from yesterday, the poll results.
Yeah. The
poll results showed that 70% of Israelis, it was 83% of Israelis. 83% of the Israelis support the tactics Israel is using against the protesters in Gaza. And 67% said they oppose any lifting of the blockade. So forget the Israelis. You got to reach the solidarity. You have to reach Western public opinion.
Just to add one more anecdote to that. In the 80s, when Israel invaded Lebanon in the early 80s, there was protest. There was thousands of people.
It's a little bit misleading. That came very late in the day. That came when Sabra and Shatila.
Fair enough.
Up until then, it was like 80% supported the invasion.
Just to put just some numbers on it. At least back then, people could be mobilized for something. There was thousands of protesting.
There was we shouldn't, I don't want to engage in hyperbole. The spectrum has shifted.
Now protests in Tel Aviv is a few hundred people.
Yeah.
That's my only point.
But totally correct.
Yeah.
There was something that you can call a dissent in Israel.
Yeah.
It no longer exists. And so, in the absence of support from the West, they're going to be ground under. One part I really got very wrong. I thought that there was still a latent solidarity movement that once Palestinians in Gaza started engaging in mass non-violent resistance would immediately get into action. And then I saw before my eyes, I was kind of bewildered. 5 weeks passed. 5 weeks. There wasn't a single demonstration for Gaza. None. There wasn't a hunger strike, except with the shining exception of the Progressive Jewish Organization, If Not Now. There were no sit-ins. There was nothing.
I want to allow for some error. Is it possible that there were some protests somewhere that
I said sitting in New York.
Okay, yeah.
I know the scene in New York.
Yeah.
There was nothing.
Mm-hmm.
And it was really, I am in contact with people in Gaza. They're crestfallen. They're heartbroken. I kept making suggestions. Let's have a vigil in front of Schumer's office. Let's go on a hunger strike. Charles Schumer, the senator from New York, who called for the economic strangulation of Gaza in 2010. And nothing came of it. Exactly what accounts for that, I can't really say. I'm pretty perplexed. But one thing's for sure, in the absence of solidarity, they're going to be ground down.